Good afternoon and welcome to the second of our NINA 911 Goes to Washington preparatory webinars. Today's webinar is titled How Congress Works. My name is Trey Forgety. I'm NINA's Director of Government Affairs and I'll be your host. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand at youtube.com/911NINA911. In addition, our slides will be posted online at www.nina.org/GTW after the broadcast concludes. We invite you to make this webinar interactive using the GoToWebinar interface to raise your hand, and we'll take selected questions live on the air toward the end of the webinar. You can also submit a text question at any time using the GoToWebinar interface, and selected questions may be addressed during the main part of the webinar or during question time at the end. Finally, before we get started, we want to thank our sponsors for 911 Goes to Washington in 2017, Airbus DSC, the home of Vesta, AT&T, Comcast, Comtech, CTIA, Ford, Frontier Business Edge, Mission Critical Partners, OnStar, West, and Verizon. In today's webinar, we're going to cover several topics, including the different kinds of offices and staff that you can encounter on Capitol Hill, the structure and demographics of each type of office's staff, how constituent messaging really gets in front of lawmakers to influence legislation, how you can get to the key staffers who can make or break your case on the Hill, and how to ask for and get the most effective meeting you can. We'll start with a look at the different types of congressional staff on the Hill, the sort of offices that you can encounter. First off, the one that most people will interact with during 911 Goes to Washington and otherwise in general dealing with the Hill are personal staff. These are staffers who work in members' offices. They handle constituent requests, draft, advocate, and advise their member on individual pieces of legislation. These are the overwhelming majority of the staff on Capitol Hill. Typically in the Washington office of a congressman, you'll see he may have 10 or 15 staffers, whereas a senator, she might have 30 or 40 or more if they're in the leadership. Next, you have committee staff. These are actually separate from the personal staff of the members. They report to the chair in the majority or ranking member on the minority side of each committee. They handle investigations and hearing prep, and they advise members during what are called markup sessions. This is where a committee considers all of the sort of minor amendments to bills as they prepare to move them toward being reported to the full chamber. Committee staff often originate legislation at the request of members. It's very common to see that happen, and particularly when there's a consensus within the majority among a committee as to what legislation should be pursued. That's when you'll see committee staff really getting involved with drafting legislation. Next, you have leadership staff. They work in each chamber's officers' staff. That's actually a separate office from the personal staff. So if you think about like Speaker Ryan in the House, he has his personal office as a member of Congress from Wisconsin, but then he also has the Speaker's office, and that office has a staff as well. It typically has, depending on the role in the chamber, it will have at least as many staff as a personal office, and in the case of a senior position like the Speaker, probably many more because they have much more to oversee. These leadership staff, they handle the highest level political operations that basically determine what legislation will move and what its contents are going to be, and how that's going to play out with important core constituencies for the party of those, the Speaker, the Leader, or the Whip. And then lastly, probably the smallest piece of all of this, the independent staff work for legislative branch agencies like the Congressional Research Service, the Government Accountability Office, or the Library of Congress. Now, those have very important roles. The Library of Congress is a very large staff. They technically are part of the legislative branch, but the Librarian of Congress, for example, is also the Register of Copyrights for the United States. So they have an enormous workload beyond just their legislative responsibilities of making information available to members of Congress on request. So let's talk now about a who's who among the three types of political staff that you're likely to encounter. personal staff, these folks typically are in their late 20s, early 30s. They often earn less than $40,000 a year, which in context, rent for a one-bedroom apartment in Washington, D.C., or one bedroom in a multi-bedroom apartment is on the order of $2,000 to $2,400 a month. So you can kind of see this is a very low-paid job, even though these folks are expected to have bachelor's or higher degrees even. And as a result, they often live with several roommates and typically have worked on the Hill 5 years or less. Moving on to committee staff, they tend to be rather longer tenured, typically mid to late 30s or early 40s. The salaries here go up a little bit, especially if they have degrees in economics or law. And they typically live alone. Some may be married, but they typically have worked on the Hill for longer, between 4 and 7 years. Now, the one exception to that may be if you have particularly a committee chair who has turned over their staff a lot because they've been there for a long time. They may bring over to the committee staff, one of their more junior staffers from a more recent campaign as a way to make space for other hires in their personal member office. Finally, you'll see leadership staff, and here it totally runs the gamut. There's no one demographic for this. You really see young, relatively inexperienced staffers who nonetheless, showed a talent for politics during a campaign or something like that and end up on leadership staff. I know I have one friend who at the age of 25 was the head staffer in the majority whip's office, and you would often see him on the floor of the House with a dozen members huddled around asking, hey, what are we doing here? Or cajoling folks to vote the way the party wanted. So these really do run the gamut. The salaries go up another little bit here, and these are usually, as I said, the best political minds in the business. They're in and out of leadership offices, party organizations, policy shops, think tanks, and congressional offices. Fast. They're political operators. So because I said before you're most likely to meet with staffers from a member's personal staff, it bears talking through a little bit what the different roles those staffers may have are within a member's office. So we're going to start here, and I'll put up a slide in a moment with an organizational chart so you can kind of visually see how all this fits together. But I'm going to talk sort of from the bottom up, from the bottom of the totem pole up to the most senior staffers. So you start off with staff assistants. These are the folks, typically very young, who handle routine tasks like foreign visa applications, overnight passport requests, constituent tours, flag requests, photographs, meet and greets with the member. Those sorts of requests are typically handled by staff assistants. Once they gain a little bit more experience in an office, staff assistants can move up to become legislative correspondents. These are the folks who receive and distribute incoming communications like issue-related phone calls, faxes, emails, and letters. The offices have a fairly sophisticated computer system that lets them intake those things, triage them by issue, assign them for resolution by individual LCs and LAs. Some LLCs may have limited responsibility for a substantive issue. So, for example, if a member has a well-known, long-standing, unchanging position on something relatively non-controversial, LCs may be in charge of responding to letters and emails about those issues. So they can do that typically with fairly limited oversight by others in the office. Moving one notch higher on the totem pole, though, you get to legislative assistants who handle most of the substantive issues that come before a typical office. And LA in the House will usually have 4 to 6 major issue areas. And here you've got to imagine someone who's 25 years old, maybe has a bachelor's degree in business, and all of a sudden they're asked to cover on an expert basis taxation, healthcare, education, trade, transportation, and telecom. That's kind of a fairly typical portfolio. That's an enormous number of things for one person to take on, and these folks really do a phenomenal job, tackling these issues, getting in, understanding as best they can at a very high level what the different outcomes of legislation will be for different issue areas, and what they should advise their boss to do. LAs will often handle more controversial topics like abortion, climate change, and marriage equality. So this is where you're getting into folks who have some more independence in how they respond on their boss's behalf. At the top of the legislative staff totem pole, you have legislative directors who have overall responsibility for an office's policy efforts, and they manage and oversee the LAs and LCs. An LD usually reports directly to a member's chief of staff. Sometimes in some offices, particularly on the Senate side, you'll have a deputy chief of staff as well, and they may divide those roles so that a chief of staff has like one issue themselves. In the House, like transportation or something like that, particularly if the member's on a committee because they want their most experienced legislative operator on that. But in other offices, the chief of staff is just that. They handle the administration of the office and sort of oversee the staff from a practical standpoint and don't necessarily have legislative responsibilities on top of that. Here we have a typical an organization that's sort of a typical member's office, a personal staff office. So within the district, you'll have a chief of staff who may have a deputy. You'll typically have the legislative director that we talked about, a senior LA, roughly 3 more legislative aides in the House, and a legislative correspondent, a press secretary who may wear other hats as well, a scheduler, and a staff assistant. And these folks work together to handle the inside Washington work of the office. So typically all the efforts related to drafting and passing legislation and responding to substantive requests from constituents. At the district level, you'll also typically have a district director, some number of caseworkers who handle interacting with federal agencies on behalf of constituents for their member. That's an important thing that members do. By calling attention to constituent requests, they can have a major impact on the outcome of things. You often hear about a veteran who needs a new wheelchair, and things get tied up with red tape until a member of Congress calls to ask a question, and suddenly, like a miracle, it's the request gets handled. And then you may also have field representatives who attend events in the district when the member of Congress can't be present themselves and deliver messages on behalf of the member and represent their interests at home, listen on behalf of the member to constituent requests, and relay those back to Washington for resolution or for discussion with the member. I discussed chiefs of staff and staff directors here. I discussed chiefs of staff in personal offices. The other important staff positions that you ought to think about with respect to the operation of committees. Staff directors on the majority and minority side run committee offices. There are typically 2 per committee, 1 for each party. And the majority staff director really is a very powerful and influential person. They typically are brought over by the chairman of the committee. Sometimes they'll be held over if the chair was part of the committee for a long time, but often they sort of belong to that particular chairperson. They oversee the committee staff and sort of control the direction internally of legislation according to the interests of the chair as those are communicated to the staff. And I want to be clear here, it really is the chair of the committee that decides how things are going to go. I mean, it's rare that even members of the chair's party exert influence over what moves in committee. It's very much dominated and controlled by the chair themselves. You'll have chief counsels who handle sort of the legal aspects of legislating. They'll often testify during markups, relay the majority party's policy standpoint to the committee during those events. They work to develop and revise drafts and prepare amendments for consideration before those events, and then sort of shepherd those along during the committee sessions. And lastly, some of the leadership offices actually employ floor directors whose job it is to be on the floor during vote time and make sure that you get the votes that you expect. The whip offices almost always have floor directors for this purpose. And a lot of times, things they've got to do, if a member doesn't want to vote on some controversial matter because they don't want to be held to it, it's these folks who, go down, track them down, drag them back to the floor, and remind them of the party's position on the legislation and the fact that they have personal commitments to the party, and sometimes even with threats of withholding party funding or generating primary opponents, they really politically motivate the members to vote the way that the party wants. Here's a look at a committee office. As I said, you've got the chair and the ranking member, the majority and minority staff directors, and then below those you have the professional staff of the committee. In the House, when control changes parties, they actually swap office spaces because the majority staff will have a lot of work to do, and the minority staff won't have much at all because they don't really have much involvement in the direction of legislation. They will do things like try to develop countervailing witnesses who can provide testimony that their party finds beneficial. The majority does not have to allow minority-appointed witnesses, and usually the most they do is allow for one. So they typically shed staff when party changes control. That will actually fire people, basically let them go. They typically land back in personal offices, leadership offices elsewhere. In the Senate, they don't change office space. They have enough space that the offices there are basically permanent, but their staff sizes do swell and shrink with changes in control of party in the chamber. Committees are very important, and I spend time on this because only a member of a committee of jurisdiction, in the House in particular, will be taken seriously with respect to the passage of legislation that falls within that committee's jurisdiction. If you're an outsider to a committee and you propose a bill, so let's say I'm a member of Congress, I'm not a member of the Energy and Commerce Committee, and I try to propose a bill about 911, well, it's never going to get a hearing, it's never going to get a markup unless I can come to some understanding with the chairman of the committee as to why that bill should move. It's very rare for things to move when you're not actually part of a committee. Only a committee chair can bring a bill or resolution forward for hearing or markup. They control the calendar, and if the chair doesn't want it heard, it won't get heard. Awareness of an issue within the Congress really is very dependent on whether things have hearings and have markups and so forth. And so from a legislative scheduling standpoint, getting those hearings and markups in early and getting the committee to actually move those is the only way that things really get done. And I would also say, only a committee can report a bill for consideration by the House or Senate. You don't normally have substantive legislation that's handled without a committee report. Now, the one exception to this in the House, if something is sort of stuck and it's not moving, the Speaker won't call the bill up for a vote, a member can file something called a discharge petition and go around and start collecting signatures from other members to try and move the legislation, notwithstanding the opposition of the Speaker or a committee chair. This is a rare procedure. I looked it up earlier today. Since 1985, it's only been used 4 times. The last time it was successfully used was in October of 2015. You may remember there was a big fight over reauthorization of the Export-Import Bank. And in that case, a discharge petition was actually circulated, and they got to 218 members of the House. It was filed, and the House had to take a vote on it, and the Ex-Im Bank was reauthorized. And then one thing that often trips people up, the committees of substantive jurisdiction can authorize the spending of some amount of money by a particular federal department or agency or instrumentality, but only one committee in each chamber can control what money is actually spent, and that's the Committee on Appropriations. So just because the Energy and Commerce Committee says, we authorize $115 million for X, unless it's in the circumstances of a special tax bill, that doesn't really do anything until the Committee on Appropriations moves an appropriations bill that specifies what will be spent. So very, very powerful and important committees in both chambers. Now, because committees matter so much, I want to quickly review the committees that matter most for 911. There are 4, 2 each in the House and Senate. On the House side, it's the Committee on Energy and Commerce, and specifically the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology. That's where legislation relating to 911 would most likely originate. It's where it has originated in the past few Congresses. The House Committee on Homeland Security, though, and its subcommittee on emergency preparedness, response, and communications also does have some limited jurisdiction in the telecom space to the extent that it touches on matters of public safety, homeland security, and national security. In the Senate, you have parallel committees. You have the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee and its subcommittee on communications, technology, innovation, and the Internet. The committees in the Senate tend to be much smaller because there are many fewer senators, but they have much broader jurisdiction. So on the Senate side, you can see there, the final vote would take place in a committee that deals with everything from weather balloons to roads and bridges. In the Senate, you also have the Committee on Homeland Security and Government Affairs, or HISGAC, one of my favorite Washingtonisms. Very powerful and important committee. Same story as the House to the extent that things touch on public safety, homeland security, national security. That's the committee of jurisdiction that would matter. And again, bicamerally, you have the committees on appropriations that control basically all government spending. So in particular, if you're coming to 911 Goes to Washington and you look up your member and your senator, and you know that they're part of one of these committees, those are the ones where it's important to say, hey, I know you're part of this committee, you've got jurisdiction of this issue, we'd really like to see something moved, can you have a word with the chairman about how important this is to us? It's a great place to do that at the committee level to get those members involved. I'll touch briefly here on some important leader offices. If you're coming in and your member or your senator fits one of these bills, I hope you'll flag that to me actually, because these are some of the most important meetings that will take place during 911 Goes to Washington. The Speaker of the House is the constitutional officer responsible for its operation, and importantly, as we'll talk about in just a few more minutes, chooses the members of the all-important Committee on Rules. Currently, the Speaker of the House is Paul Ryan, a Republican from Wisconsin, and he is, the most powerful figure in the House, and really does ultimately control what legislation will move or not. On the Senate side, his parallel is the President of the Senate. That is the Vice President, Mike Pence. They serve when it's necessary to break ties in the Senate, and historically it's been a bit, how to put this, a bit controversial legally whether the Vice President was actually part of the legislative branch or the executive branch, because his principal duties under the Constitution are really to the legislative branch, even though he is sort of the backstop to the president as well. Next, you have majority and minority. Well, I should say one other thing here. In the Senate, they also have a president pro tempore who presides when the vice president is not around. Customarily, the person who holds that title officially is the senior-most member of the majority party. Currently, that's Senator Orrin Hatch, Republican from Utah. He became the president pro tem on January 6th of this year. Day to day, the president pro tem is actually some junior senator that, in a ritual that some describe as hazing, are required to sit in and essentially operate the mechanics of the Senate for the purpose of helping them to learn the rules and procedures of the chamber. On both sides of the hill, you have majority and minority leaders who control the flow of debate. So this will be an elected senior Republican and an elected senior Democrat. When a bill is debated, they will control the time for their party and parcel it out to individual members as they see fit. So oftentimes something that you'll see happen if a member of the Republican Party, say, is crossways with the party, he or she may not be recognized by their leader and might actually have to try to get time from the Democrats in order to speak about something in debate, and that can be hard to do, because the other party, even though they may appreciate having your support for their position, they want their own members to be seen as the ones making progress on that issue. So it may be hard to get time from them. In the Senate, this is an especially powerful position because the majority leader has a customary right to be the first senator recognized when more than one rises at the same time. And that may not seem like a big deal, but because the rules of the Senate do still allow for filibusters, that special right of first recognition allows the majority leader to prevent, in many cases, a filibuster of every little thing that comes up. So that right of first recognition really is a very powerful tool on the Senate side. Now you also, and I mentioned these before, you have majority and minority whips. These are the party's enforcers. They encourage, cajole, and even threaten people to maintain party discipline. If you ever saw the first season of House of Cards, Frank Underwood, the central character, his role in that season, he was the majority whip. It's a very powerful position. They often control the flow of party money. So if you want your re-election campaign in the House to go well, to have the backing of the party, when the majority whip comes calling and says, look, you're going to vote for this, you've got to weigh very carefully whether you can be re-elected without the party's support before you vote in the opposite direction. So that's among the many tools that the whips employ to maintain party discipline. Now, I spoke before about the House Rules Committee and its importance, and this is one of the, I think, least understood aspects of how the House operates. In the House of Representatives, you have 435 voting members, 5 delegates, and 1 resident commissioner. And with 541 people, you can't let everybody speak as long as they want the way you do in the Senate, because there just isn't time for it. There's no way you'd ever get anything done, and as a result, the time for debate has to be limited. So for that purpose, we have something called the Committee on Rules. It's also known as the Speaker's Committee, and they're the ones who establish how every bill or resolution that comes across the desk will be considered. And this committee, it's basically stacked at the whim of the Speaker. It always has twice as many plus 1 members from the majority party as the minority. Right now there are 9 Republicans and 4 Democrats on the Rules Committee. And they decide what the terms of the rule are going to be that any given bill is going to be considered under. There are 4 typical types that you see here. An open rule that allows any member to offer any number of amendments. A modified open rule which allows anybody to offer amendments but only on specified subjects. You see a lot of modified open rules because they kind of keep legislation to one topic. You don't end up with what are called Christmas tree bills with ornaments of every kind hung on them. You can have a structural rule or a structured rule. This will actually specify in the rule who may offer an amendment, what subject they're allowed to offer it on, and what order those will be considered in. When you have big, complex legislation that even members of the Speaker's party may have differing views on, you'll often see a structured rule that specifies these things. And you will also see closed rules that only allow particular amendments by a substantive committee to be considered, so it's even more controlled. Each rule type contains time limits for the debate and the permitted amendments. So, for example, you'll get 5 minutes of debate equally divided between the 2 parties and controlled by the leader and the ranking member. And the other thing that you hear about pretty frequently here, and it's kind of strange to me, this was actually controversial at one point in time, but a lot of rules are actually self-executing. So to save legislative time, they'll actually put a rule to a vote, and if the rule is adopted, the bill is deemed to be passed. That's a very common legislative sort of thing, and historically it's been used for both controversial and non-controversial legislation until during the debate on the Affordable Care Act there was a lot of media attention to the rule action on that, because at one point in time the Democrats actually proposed to use a self-executing rule so that voting for the rule had the effect of voting for the bill, and if the rule passed, the bill was deemed to be passed. Again, very common procedure, both parties use all the time, but all of a sudden, because the legislation was controversial, the rule became controversial. And so you saw a lot about that in the media. Now, to give you a little idea of how members spend their time, I pulled this chart from information that both the Democratic and Republican congressional campaign committees supply to their freshman members about how they should be spending their days in Washington. And you'll see a huge fraction of that time, about 40%, needs to be devoted to fundraising for their next campaign, because especially in the House, they serve for 2-year terms only, and they've got to raise money for the next campaign, which will start in as little as 18 months after they're sworn in. So they spend a huge amount of time fundraising, about half that amount of time on constituent visits and committee and floor operations each, 10% on strategic outreach, which is reaching out to other organizations and offices and so forth. Some of that time really, honestly, is also about fundraising, and then about 10% of their time on recharging activities, whether it's reading, going to the gym, etc. And that's been pretty consistent in the past few years. Every Congress, that fundraising number goes up a little bit. I wouldn't care to hazard a guess just how high it's gotten today, but a minimum of 40% of their time needs to be spent on that. So you can see very little of their actual working time is available for things like the meetings that you're getting during 911 Goes to Washington, and that's why these are so very important. On average, 911 Goes to Washington attendees like you will get 30 minutes or less with a member and or personal staffer one time a year. But that personal staffer, they're there with their member all week long, week in and week out throughout the legislative year. And even if they only speak with their member 5 times per chat, and they do it 3 or 4 times a week, they'll spend 435 minutes talking with their legislator across a typical 29-week House calendar. And the great thing about this from your standpoint is those legislative aides can also suggest legislation that their members should support, should introduce, should co-sponsor. And those are things that we all want. So making sure that the LAs who are going to be there when you can't be there are up to speed on what the ask is, why it's important, and the essential educational aspects that we're here to do about 911 is really, really critical, because they're your inside advocates long after you have left 911 Goes to Washington. So at this point, you're probably ready to make the call to get your meetings for 911 Goes to Washington. We're at about the right time frame. So we want to talk a bit about the right way to do that. And first off, calling the correct office and sounding informed is really the best thing to do, because if it sounds on the phone like you're unsure about what you're doing, you're less likely to get a meeting with the LC, LA, or member that you need to, simply because their time is so very precious. I can tell you a 15-minute meeting to one of these staffers really diverts a lot of their time and mental energy from the enormous crushing workload that they have given the small size of congressional staffs these days. So unless you have an existing membership or relationship with the member's district staff, it's always best to call the DC office directly to request a meeting in Washington. When you do that, you specifically want to talk to their district scheduler, or their Washington scheduler, excuse me, District of Columbia scheduler, but their Washington scheduler. Now, when you go to make those calls, if you log into your member account at nina.org and update your profile with a personal address, your member bio page will actually show you contact information for your representative and senators. That's a feature of NINA membership in our website, and we hope you'll take advantage of that to help you quickly make your appointments with members on the Hill. If you know their name or district number, you can also email me if you can't get access to the website for some reason, and I can help set you up with information about the member or their public safety or telecom LA. They also have this information on their websites. They'll have direct dial numbers for their DC offices. That's the best way to do this. I do want to say, though, typically it's best to avoid using their websites where they have contact forms. Those typically feed into a lower priority queue from the standpoint of the back-end system on handling constituent requests. So you want to avoid using the web forms and instead actually make a voice call and speak with someone directly when requesting a meeting. So the right time to make your request is very important as well. Doing it too early means it's likely to get lost due to high staff turnover in these offices. Again, mostly younger folks, very low pay, especially compared to the cost of living here, and so there is very high turnover. So you don't want to make your request too early and perhaps have it lost in the shuffle. You also don't want to make it too late. If you get within about 2 weeks of a meeting, you have the potential of getting stuck meeting with a more junior staffer, or no one at all for that matter. And then you haven't wasted a trip, but you've certainly used it less optimally than you could have. And again, make certain you're making that request directly to the scheduler, unless you have pre-existing relationship with someone else. And here, I will say, if you do have a pre-existing relationship with an LA in particular, it's great to reach out directly to that LA and say, hey, I'm coming in, would love to meet with you and your boss. Can we please schedule that? Now, what they're likely to do is hand you off directly to the scheduler to make that appointment. But then the LA knows about the meeting request in advance, and they can sort of brief the boss. They can be better prepared for it, and they're more likely to be up to speed on your issues and ready to talk in detail. I suggest here that you do call early in the day in your particular time zone. That helps you to beat the rush. And then always offer to confirm your request by fax or email. And I'll just let you know, to make this process even simpler for you, we actually have on our website, neenah.org/GTW, a draft meeting request letter that you can customize. It's in Word. You can customize that document and send it by fax, email, or snail mail. Fax or email probably best, and if you're doing that, make sure you always send it as a PDF and not as a Word document, just so that it has an easier time getting through. Some offices may actually request after you call in that you use the web form anyway. Again, I always prefer to make the call first, but if they do ask for that, be sure to do it. Some places that's just kind of the controls the process flow that way. So for meeting requests, if you are asked to use the web form, that's great. Go ahead and do so, but just know that making the call first is always very important. If you're making a request by phone, after you've asked to speak directly with the Congresswoman's DC scheduler, tell them that you are a constituent, and that's a very important point because only constituents get meetings that matter. If you're not from their district, legally speaking, they don't care about you. Like, you don't exist to them. You can't vote for them. You're essentially meaningless. So make sure that you're calling your members, tell them that you're a constituent and where you're from, and that you'll be in Washington February 28th and March 1st, and that you'd like to meet with the Congresswoman briefly to talk about some important 911 issues. Now, here's the best thing. Always say that you would like to include the LA who handles telecom or public safety issues for that particular Congresswoman. If you know their name, use it. That tells the scheduler that you're serious, that you know what you're doing. It gives you, really a leg up. And in particular, if your member is a chair or ranking member of a relevant committee or subcommittee, one of those that I talked about before, you should ask if the member could possibly bring along either the staff director or another committee staffer with responsibility on our issues. This really helps to raise awareness with the committee staff that, hey, the bosses think enough of this issue, think it's important enough to have me along to a meeting. The committee should really be paying attention to this. Meeting times, offer to schedule after 1:45 on the 28th or any time on the 1st. Those are the 2 days that we've got set up with more limited or no programming in the GTW space other than a sack break on the 1st, so that you'll be able to spend time on the Hill actually meeting with the offices. And then close with just saying, if you could confirm the meeting by email, you can reach me at this address. They'll typically ask for your affiliation and your contact info early in the call anyway, but make sure you provide that again at the end. Now, in terms of getting set up with these meetings, and I apologize, I've got an error here. This should actually, be the 15th for our last webinar on successful meetings, but again, our member and district information is available in your bio form at neenah.org, and you can also call our office at 202-466-4911 to reach me. I'm at extension 106, and we can discuss your member of LA if need be. Now, the all-important question that I start getting queries about weeks and months before the congressional calendar is even set. But that I know everybody is really eager to know. When you request a meeting, folks are going to ask what it is you want to talk about. Well, we have two legislative priorities, but really only one that we're going to play up big time this year, and that is we want Congress to accelerate the deployment of Next Generation 911 with a major infusion of federal capital to help us meet the Next Gen 911 Now Coalition's priority of getting NG 911 deployed nationwide by the end of the year 2020. That is what we're going to be spending most of our time on. We'll be talking about that in the context of your meetings during our next webinar. And that's what our meeting request letter is geared toward. But we also may have an additional priority related to multi-line telephone system legislation. Non-comprehensive bill has already been passed in the House and may very soon be marked up in the Senate. Those may be marked up and passed before we even get here for 911 Goes to Washington. If they're not, we will be pressing Congress to actually make those bills more comprehensive, because right now they basically only cover direct dialing and they leave things like location, on-site notification, etc. Out in whole or in part. We would like to see that made more comprehensive. Before we get into taking questions, I do want to take another moment to thank the sponsors of 911 Goes to Washington for their assistance and for making today's webinar possible. They are Airbus DSC, the home of Vesta, AT&T, Comcast, Comtech, CTIA, Ford, Frontier Business Edge, Mission Critical Partners, OnStar, West, and Verizon. Now, at this time, if you have any questions about how Congress works, I invite you to submit those using the GoToWebinar interface, or you can raise your hand and we may be able to select you to ask your question live on the air. So, do we have any questions? Oh, I have a great one here about how we can find out who the members of committees are. So there's two great sources for this. Each individual party actually maintains a website for the committee. The official committee website is maintained by the majority party, so it'll be Republicans in both the House and Senate now. Those websites are great. You can look those up pretty easily. The other place where you can typically get that information is Wikipedia. The committee staffs themselves have been known to edit those as members join and leave the committees. So you can always look, like the Energy and Commerce Committee, look that up, and you'll be able to see, who the chair, the ranking member, vice chair, etc., on down the line are. And if those are your members, you'll be able to reach directly to their personal websites and then on to their contact information. We have time for one more question, I think, if anyone else has one. All right, hearing none, we will go ahead and end our webinar a few minutes early. As I said again at the beginning of the webinar will be posted online at youtube.com/911 Nina911, and the slides will be available on our website at nina.org/GTW. All right, thanks everyone. We appreciate your joining our webinar, and we hope you have a great week, and we'll see you again on the 15th.